And you wanted to talk about Thames Water.
I did want to talk about Thames Water, yeah, because I think this is perhaps an area where you might argue that state intervention is justified. So, shall I give you a bit of a potted history of Thames Water? I don't know if you know the whole history. So, water companies were privatised by Margaret Thatcher in 1989. I know you weren't around, so you won't remember. We had, because of the whole wave of privatisations at the time, and I think Thatcher really did honestly believe that we would end up with our utilities owned by thousands of ordinary shareholders who would receive a dividend from those companies, see them really thriving, and it would be a kind of win-win scenario. And there was a big advertising campaign, I think it was around British Gas actually, rather than the water companies, where it was, tell Sid that he can register for British Gas shares. And everybody was passing little notes, here's the phone number to ring to get your prospectus and things. You might be able to find one of those adverts on YouTube if you search hard enough. So, that idea that you would have a democracy of individual shareholders, I think, was partly the dream of privatisation, but I don't think it ever really became that. So, although thousands of people did buy shares individually, very soon those shares were bought by the institutional investors, the banks, pension funds, fund management companies. And then so that was 1989. In 2001, the whole organisation of Thames Water was purchased by RWE, which is a German utilities company, and it was effectively taken off the stock market. So they bought all the shares, they turned it into a private company. And that in and of itself, I think, is quite a problematic thing. Lots and lots of businesses are now owned privately, and that means that they don't meet the same transparency requirements as stock exchange listed companies. So that in and of itself is a problem. But that's what happened. So it was owned by the German utilities company for a while. And then it was sold to Macquarie. Now, Macquarie are, do you know who they are? So they're an Australian kind of, they're quite often called a bank, but I think they're kind of a kind of financial conglomerate, really. And what they did was they bought the company, and I think they bought it for something like 5.1 billion. But of that, 2.8 billion was debt that Macquarie took on in order to have the money to buy the business from RWE. Now, the other part of the money came from the investors who were invested in Macquarie's, I think it was called the European Infrastructure Fund. So different fund managers would put their money with Macquarie. Macquarie would pool all that money together and use it to buy Thames Water. So they bought Thames Water, and after the purchase of the business, they, I think in 2 tranches, took out £2 billion worth of debt, which they effectively used to repay the debt that Macquarie had taken out to purchase the company. So in other words, they transferred that debt from Macquarie into the Thames Water business. Now, that was despite the fact that Ofwat at the time had said that the regulated body, Thames Water, the company, would be the debt would be ring-fenced away from Thames Water. And it turned out that the debt wouldn't be ring-fenced from a subsidiary of Thames Water registered in the Cayman Islands that the business set up after the sale to Macquarie. And that's where the debt effectively was taken out. So Macquarie's ownership, I think you would say, was a bit of a litany of disaster. They would deny this, but the judge who sat in a case taken by the Environment Agency accused them of massive underinvestment, diabolical management, and it led to, a number of cases where they heavily polluted the Thames and other rivers. So there was regulatory intervention because of all that. So, needless to say, during this time, the Thames Water business was paying very significant dividends to those owners of the business. The owners of the business being the owners of the Macquarie European Infrastructure Fund. So, fund management companies, pension schemes, all those kind of people. So, I mean, I think if you wanted to point the finger at where it all went wrong, I would say that happened during the Macquarie ownership period, because that is where, things were, I think, at their worst. I think it was 2012 to 2014 where they had the big discharges of pollution. So Macquarie then sold on the business. I think we're now in around 2017, to a group of owners, which included the Canadian pension schemes and some UK pension schemes, including the Universities Superannuation Scheme. That's the pension scheme that looks after the pensions of the academics in the universities. And I think it's fair to say they probably didn't really understand the scale of the problems. And whilst they tried to put things back on the right track, they really weren't able to do that. So it was during that time that the company effectively became insolvent. And I think USS lost about £600 million because their investment in it became worthless, effectively. So what happened then was that the company was effectively put into the hands of the people who had lent the company money. So as well as the equity shareholders, the people who owned the equity in the business, there was further debt in the business, and that was owned by, people like Silver Point. They're one of the big US hedge funds, those kind of organisations. But also some people like M&G, that's the UK fund manager. They also owned some of that debt. So they have been running the organisation since, I think, about 2023. And it's staggering on. I think it would be the best way to describe what's happening. It's really struggling, and it's kind of one of the first things on the agenda for our new Prime Minister is to decide what to do. So our understanding is that what he would like to do is to effectively put this organisation into effectively insolvency. It's a special administration regime, a SAR is the technical terminology for that. But to do that, he would have to prove that the company was insolvent, or it would have to fail on its regulatory promises. So it's not.
Is that a bit like the train operating companies, where it becomes the operator of last resort or something?
Yes, yeah. So I think in Railtrack, when Railtrack kind of fell over and became insolvent, the government effectively had to take it over, and that was through a special administration regime.
Northern Rail, TransPennine.
With the franchises.
The franchises, yeah.
Yeah. I don't think it's quite the same as that, because I think effectively in those circumstances, the franchise owners effectively said, we can't do it anymore, and almost handed it over. Whereas I think the situation now is much more tricky. So all those, I think there's about over 100 creditors of Thames Water. It's not just one or two organisations you're dealing with. You're dealing with this huge list of characters of people who've lent the organisation money. And whilst those, you might say, well, the business is insolvent, it's not worth anything. You've lost all your money.
Yeah.
The reality will be that those creditors will have taken charges over the assets of Thames Water. They wouldn't have lent that money without saying, well, what happens if you go insolvent? What do we get?
Bit like a mortgage, the way that the bank repossesses the home.
Exactly. I was exactly going to say that. So if you imagine an office building, if Thames Water become insolvent, then the creditor says, well, that building's now ours.
Yeah.
So, that means that it's very difficult for government to say, well, we're taking over because you're insolvent, because then the creditors will say, well, you're not having that building
Yeah.
and you're not having that reservoir.
But what are the assets? The pipes, the reservoirs?
The reservoirs, the pipes, the buildings, yeah.
The government can't really say, okay, well, yeah, you can take the pipes.
Absolutely. So it's actually really, because I think what will end up happening is there'll be a massive legal wrangle.
And will the government just take on the debt?
Well, that's part of the legal wrangle, I think. So, if the special administration regime would say, and to get a special administration regime, you have to go through 3 months consultation and it has to be signed off by the High Court. And part of that special administration regime will be deciding who's going to get what. Now, it might be that you would say, well, you've got £1 billion worth of debt that you've lent the business. We'll give you 800 million of government stock to replace it. So they lose the 200 million on the basis that that's the best deal they can get. They call that a haircut. They take a haircut of 200 million. Now, all that wrangling is just a case of, good old-fashioned red in tooth and claw negotiation. But they will play very hard ball. And the real difficulty for government is that there is a rescue plan on the table. So a conglomerate of different lenders, including some of the existing ones, have proposed a bailout, which involves them putting more debt into the business, putting some equity into the business and writing some debt off.
And the government turned it down, didn't they?
Well, I think that's the problem at the moment. We're all in limbo, really, because and if they just say no to that, effectively the company's teetering on the brink of insolvency.
And part of that agreement, I think, is that there would be less regulation on a lot of the the sewage spills and stuff.
Yeah.
And this is the arguments made in the productive state about the fact that if you want to encourage private investment, you have to take a hit on the regulation. Otherwise, if you overregulate too much, private capital is just going to say, no, okay, we're not going to get involved in this.
Yeah.
And so there is that balance.
Yeah. So part of the deal is definitely that they would want some of the penalty regime turned off for a period.
These are the fines that are issued towards water companies if there's sewage leaks.
Correct, yeah. Or if they fail to provide services as well, not just sewage. So it's a really tricky situation for the...
What would Margaret think?
Margaret Thatcher?
Yeah.
I think she'd be disappointed. I mean, I think she really did have in her head this dream of there would be thousands of ordinary working people, in the same way that she thought there's ordinary working people who own their council house. There'd be ordinary working people who had their little portfolio of shares and they'd have £200 in Thames water and they might get £5 a year income from that. And I think that's what she thought privatisation would mean. Maybe I'm being very romantic and thinking that's what she thought, but I kind of think that she thought that is what would... But that's what would come out of privatisation. And certainly that's how they sold it to us. Maybe I'm just, very naive.
For us to move forward as a country, do you think there needs to be a consensus around the fact that Thatcher's kind of been proved wrong on a few of these things?
Absolutely. I think not every single privatisation was a failure, but I think the idea that you privatise these essential services, I think, was taking the wrong turning, as the Prime Minister said. And actually it's far more privatised than other countries. The UK is very different, certainly in water. Other countries have not gone down the route that we've gone down. So I think it is a mistake. And I think the idea of taking back control, if you want to put it that way, of our water needs to happen. I think it's tricky to find ways to do it, but that's certainly what I would be arguing for.